Hi there. Going to spend some time today talking about the state of the economy in Mexico, and I'm going to do this from mostly a historical lens. So we're going to start thinking about the more economic nationalist policies of the pre, and then we will look at a series of economic crises that are going to lead to a change to a policy of neoliberalism and reducing state intervention. So let's start with what I'll call a period of economic nationalism. I'm not sure that there's a super neat conceptual term to apply to this, but that's the closest thing that I could come up with. This is a period during the early part of the Pre's rule in which the state is going to be fairly active in intervening in order to develop the economy and to try and promote stability and better living conditions for the majority of the Mexican people. Before I start, I do want to put a quick asterisk on this, which is that, as you know from our conversations about political competition, there's a lot of competition within the Pre during the period of one-party rule. There's a lot of disagreement ideologically about what the state's role in the economy should be. And so some of that stuff is going to play out in this period, right? So some presidents will be more aggressive than others. Some factions will be more supportive than others of these economic nationalist policies. So just be aware that I'm painting this with a fairly broad brush and that there's always going to be exceptions and dissent. So the president that we most strongly associate with economic nationalism under one-party rule in Mexico is a guy named Lázaro Cárdenas, who serves as president from 1934 to 1940. He is really the person most strongly associated with trying to use the powers of the state to intervene in the economy and to fulfill the more radical promises of the Mexican Revolution. Remember that revolution has some people who are really more moderate and just interested in political change, and some people who are more radical and interested in economic transformation and redistribution of Mexico's resources, and Cardenas falls in that latter category. A couple of major reforms that he implements that demonstrate that commitment to really transforming the state's role in the economy. One is to create these communal peasant farms called ejidos. We've talked about these a little bit in the context of the Zapatista uprising in 1994. The abolition of ejidos, I'm skipping ahead to the 1980s here, and the privatization of farmland in Mexico was a major grievance for the Zapatistas and for many indigenous farming communities. But those forms of property ownership date back to the Cardenas administration when he takes advantage of that provision of the Mexican Constitution, Article 27, which allows the state to take control of private property. In his case, he's going to redistribute it into these small peasant farms that are, in the process, he's going to give control over land to about 750,000 people in Mexico who had previously been landless. So from that, you can make some guesses about his populist ideology and the base of his support. The other important thing that Cardenas does in the 1930s is to nationalize oil companies. At this point, Mexico has a pretty significant oil sector, but a great deal of it is run by foreign corporations. And Cardenas will make this argument that we'll see in a couple of other countries in this course as well, that it's the Mexican people who should profit from Mexico's oil. And so he boots out those foreign companies and instead takes over oil and subsoil resources in Mexico, which is provided for in the 1917 Constitution. And he creates a company called Pemex, which is going to have a monopoly over oil production from the Cardenas administration all the way up to 2014. We'll get to that at the end of this video. So this is really kind of a high watermark for state intervention in the Mexican economy up until another intervention in the 1980s, but we'll get there momentarily. Cardenas is, as I said, the sort of most committed president of this period to economic nationalism, but many presidents from a variety of different ideological positions embrace a broader idea about how Mexico should develop, and that idea is known as import substitution industrialization. You'll hear about this is not a uniquely Mexican policy. You'll hear about it in a few other contexts as well. The idea behind ISI is that the state needs to take an active role in the economy in order to promote industrialization and in order to promote development. We often see this being implemented in the 20th century in countries that have either been colonized and are newly independent, or countries that weren't directly colonized but have played this kind of subsidiary role in the global economy of just exporting raw materials and then importing manufactured goods. Mexico tries to get out of that position through these import substitution industrialization policies. And so through the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, you'll see many different Mexican governments support high tariffs in order to protect Mexican manufacturers and farmers from competition with imported goods, and also state support for businesses, particularly in the industrial sector, through things like providing subsidized energy, providing low taxes on businesses in order to encourage Mexican businesses to develop and to become more competitive. The result of those policies is what is widely known as the Mexican miracle, which is a period of sustained and stable economic growth from the 1940s, when the post-World War II recovery really gives Mexico's economy a kickstart, all the way up through the 1970s. There's some degree of debate about how much to credit ISI policies versus how much to credit the global economic situation, but indisputably, Mexico's economy does quite well and really outperforms expectations for a fairly long period, and that's pretty impressive. One other thing to note is that despite the nationalistic rhetoric of a number of pre-presidents and leaders during this period, the United States kind of inevitably is going to assume a really prominent position in Mexico's economy. Even long before NAFTA, long before liberalization, the United States is going to be the major source of foreign direct investment in Mexico. Mexico isn't closed off completely to foreign investment in this period, and the United States is also going to be the primary destination for exports from Mexico. And so, despite the attempts and the many successes of the various pre-administrations from Cardenas onwards in trying to make Mexico's economy more independent and more developed, the United States is still going to be very, very closely intertwined with Mexico's economy. There's really no way around that. Let me show you in quantitative terms what I've just been telling you in words. This is a graph of GDP per capita in Mexico from 1950 up through 2017. And in this period from 1950 up to 1980, you can see almost continuous sustained growth in gross domestic product per capita. Don't take these dates too seriously. There's not a particularly well-defined start or end date to this so-called Mexican miracle. It's an idea and not a really precise historical concept. But from that period, you can see the GDP per capita, which is kind of our easiest benchmark for comparing economic growth. You're going to see it rise more or less steadily throughout that period. However, if you look ahead after 1980, you're going to start to see a considerable degree of fluctuation over the next couple of decades. And so that's the next thing that we should talk about. Is this period of economic crises in Mexico that's going to have significant policy and political implications. So this is not a class that requires you to learn detailed economic history. I'm not the teacher who's going to teach you detailed economic history. So I'm going to simplify this a little bit, but the short version is that from the 1970s to the 1990s, Mexico is going to undergo a period in which the Mexican miracle is no longer nearly as impressive. There's going to be a good degree of economic instability, rising unemployment, much more rapid inflation, meaning that the peso is going to be less valuable. Prices in general are going to rise in Mexico. And there's also going to be currency crises, meaning that the value of the peso relative to other currencies is going to decline, or fluctuate rapidly, which wreaks havoc on anybody who is engaged in international trade in Mexico. A couple of reasons for these various economic crises without getting too deep into the narrative. One is that if you think back in time to 1968, with the massacre of student protesters who were peacefully protesting the Olympics and a variety of other grievances in Mexico City, you might note that that's kind of the beginning of the PRI's crisis of legitimacy. And so the president who comes into office in 1970 is going to start saying, well, we might need to turn our attention to meeting the needs of the people in order to shore up the PRI's legitimacy, in order to keep this system running, in order to stop the people from throwing us out of power. And so he's going to engage in a much more radical and expensive program of social spending, and that's going to be financed, among other things, through borrowing money. So Mexico's going to start running a bigger budget deficit in the 1970s. Part of that also has to do with fluctuating oil prices, as we will see time and time again, because for some reason a ton of the countries in the AP CompGov course produce large amounts of oil. No one country controls the price of oil. You can't just produce less oil and say, oh, this will jack up the price, because there's a lot of other countries that are producing exactly the same thing. And so fluctuations in oil prices in the 1970s are also going to really do a number on Mexico's budget, because if you have made your budget anticipating that oil is going to be selling at $80 a barrel, and the price of oil is actually $40 a barrel, suddenly you're going to owe somebody a whole bunch of money, and you might have made spending commitments that you can no longer afford, and it's going to be hard to back out of that. Then one more thing, which is a little bit less intuitive. In the late 1970s, more oil is discovered in the Gulf of Mexico. Mexico has been a significant oil producer and exporter all the way through the 20th century, but there's a significant additional discovery of oil in the late 1970s. If you are a normal person and not an economist, what you should be thinking is, gosh, that seems like it would be really good because this is going to give Mexico a whole bunch more money. But the problem, and we'll get into this more when we talk about Nigeria and the resource curse, but the problem for Mexico is that this discovery is going to encourage the people in charge of Mexico's budget to think that they have a lot more money coming into the government treasury than is actually going to be the case. They make exorbitant predictions about what the price of oil is going to be that turn out to be not nearly true. Lots of international lenders are willing to lend Mexico's government even more money because they assume that Mexico will have a ton of oil coming in. And so Mexico borrows money on top of what it's anticipating is going to come from increased oil revenues. And when the oil price doesn't turn out to be nearly as high as they had predicted it would be, this is just going to make those problems of overborrowing and overspending even bigger. And so the long story short, a variety of both bad decisions and bad luck are going to lead Mexico's economy to become a whole lot less stable in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. Different governments are going to present a variety of different solutions, and you won't necessarily see a consistent narrative here. Just know they're going to try a bunch of different things. One of the most extreme sort of statist solutions here is that in 1982, President Lopez Portillo is going to decree the nationalization of the banks. I've read one paper on this topic that describes this as essentially a temper tantrum, but he takes advantage of that fairly expansive provision in Mexico's constitution, giving the government a lot of power to expropriate private property, to just totally take over Mexico's banking system. Worth noting, this has since been reversed, but it's definitely going to irritate a number of people in Mexico's private sector. It's actually going to contribute to the increased popularity of the PAN because a number of business interests are going to defect from supporting the PRI and start supporting this more right-wing, economically conservative party, or I should say economically liberal party, because they no longer trust the PRI to not go around nationalizing the banks. So that's kind of the extreme status solution. On the other end, Mexico is going to turn to an organization called the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. At later points, it's going to turn to the United States as well. And on a couple of occasions, the IMF and other international lenders are going to lend Mexico money to help bail it out, to help it stabilize the currency, to help stabilize the economy. But when the IMF lends money in the 70s, 80s, 90s, it doesn't come as just a, hey, do what you want, we trust you kind of package. It always comes with strings attached. And these particular strings are known as structural adjustment policies. In other words, when the IMF bails Mexico out, it requires Mexico, as a condition for getting that loan, to implement a variety of economic liberalization policies. For instance, letting its currency float at market values, rather than having the government regularly intervene to keep the peso at a certain exchange rate relative to, say, the United States dollar. So that's going to force some degree of economic liberalization on Mexico. One last solution that you'll see is the government attempting to dial back social spending. And at some point, the PRI government is actually going to reach an agreement with other major sectors, with the workers and with the farmers, that everybody is going to just accept that the government cannot spend as much money on social services as it has been. And so the government will implement some programs of austerity. It is, I think, beyond the scope of this course for us to spend a whole bunch of time trying to decide which of those things worked. But the net effect is going to be that by the late 1990s, Mexico's economy is going to stabilize. The inflationary spirals of rising prices are largely going to be over. And you can see, if you dial back to that GDP per capita chart over time, that economic growth, although not quite as steadily, has resumed. So this marks the shift. These crises in the 80s are going to mark the shift towards a completely different policy of economic liberalization. Sometimes we might say neoliberalism, because it's an attempt to roll back earlier policies of state intervention in the economy. And I'll describe that in really broad strokes for you right now, and then we'll think about two specific examples of liberalization that are important for contemporary Mexican politics. So starting roughly in the 1980s, the economic liberalization is going to be the dominant policy of pre-presidents. And I do want to note for you that although part of the reason for this is because the IMF required Mexico to engage in structural adjustment policies in order to get really critical loans to bail out the government, it's not just that the international lending community had forced these policies on Mexico. There is some genuine support for them within sectors of the PRI and particularly among Mexico's business community. So a couple of key policies, and you will hear me list these policies over and over again anytime we are talking about economic liberalization. First, privatization. The Mexican government is going to start selling off a variety of businesses that the state had been operating and hand them back to the private sector. So that includes reversing the nationalization of the banks that had happened in 1982, and a number of other state-owned or state-supported manufacturers are also going to be privatized. The end of land reform, which we talked about a little bit when we talked about the Zapatista uprising, is another part of this, right? So pre-presidents who support liberalization will argue that peasant farmers basically work plots of land that are too small to be particularly productive, and that they need to own their property individually so that they can borrow against it and make more investments in productive technology. And so we have a shift from these collectively owned ejidos in the countryside, which date back to the Cardenas administration, towards private property in the countryside, and that's going to be controversial for reasons that we've already discussed. Number three, you're going to see Mexico move towards policies of free trade. So those last sort of tariff barriers that have been part of the import substitution industrialization policy are going to come down, most notably with the implementation of NAFTA in 1994. And then going with that, Mexico is going to continue pursuing even more foreign investment. Again, not a total sea change. Foreign companies have been investing in Mexico for a long time. That never totally went away. But Mexico is going to make its rules friendlier to foreign companies investing in Mexico, creating jobs in Mexico, extracting profits from Mexico. Result, again, broadly speaking. Number one, the middle class indisputably has gotten a lot larger in Mexico. That tends to be the group of people that drives consumption, that drives economic growth, if what you're interested in is producing goods that make people's lives a little bit easier. And so there is definitely a much bigger middle class in Mexico than there used to be. Number two, and going along with that, inequality is going to increase in Mexico, particularly, of course, between the very rich and the very poor. Some people win from economic liberalization, other people do not, and those effects are also going to be regionally concentrated. Because the north of Mexico, as we've said on a couple of occasions, benefits more than the south from economic liberalization, a third consequence of liberalization will be to some degree that you see migration from the south to the north, because economic conditions are better in the north, because more jobs are available in the north as the manufacturing sector there grows due to its proximity to the United States. That dynamic has slowed down a little bit, but it's just worth pointing out, in part because it tells you how liberalization can affect social cleavages, in part because it's just an important reminder that when Americans talk about migration in Mexico, they often think just about migration between Mexico and the United States, but it's at least as important to think about migration within Mexico, which is a key effect of liberalization. Okay, I want to focus on two areas in economic liberalization that remain important to explaining how the Mexican economy works today and over the last 40 years or so. The first is foreign trade. And when I say foreign trade, I think it's again worth noting that the United States is by far Mexico's largest trade partner. So foreign trade, and particularly the growth of American-owned factories in Mexico that are designed to take advantage of cheaper labor there, dates back way before NAFTA and even into this period where the dominant policy of Mexico's government remains import substitution industrialization. But things are always more complicated than they seem, and there's going to be some key exceptions to that. Before, I think, 1965, for a long time, the United States had maintained this immigration program called the Bracero Program, which granted temporary short-term visas to Mexican farm workers to come to the United States to do seasonal agricultural labor on American farms, and then to go back to Mexico. And that was a major source of employment, especially for people living in the north of Mexico, for whom essentially the commute was shorter. The U.S. ends the Bracero Program in 1965, and this is going to create this massive crisis of unemployment, particularly in northern Mexico, for people who no longer have the legal ability to cross the border and get those jobs in American farms. And so one of the Mexican government's responses is going to be something called the Border Industrialization Program. What that does is give preferential tax treatment to factories in Mexico owned by American companies, that are going to import raw materials or parts to their factories in Mexico and then have them assembled in Mexico by Mexican laborers and then re-export those back to the United States. So this is an example of trade liberalization and economic liberalization that goes back way before NAFTA. Worth noting that NAFTA is not the first instance at which Mexico really actively encourages trade with the United States. The result of the border industrialization program is that we have these factories on Mexico's northern border with the United States popping up called maquiladoras. And these are factories that import materials from the US and re-export manufactured goods to the US. The advantage from the Mexican government's perspective is that this is going to create jobs in Mexico, which are higher paying than the alternative, which at this point is widespread unemployment. The advantage for American factories is that labor in Mexico is cheaper than labor in the United States. And so this is going to enable them to reduce their labor costs. The development of those industries, of course, is going to be accelerated by the really big deal trade agreement known as NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which goes into effect on January 1st, 1994. If the rules of that agreement significantly reduce tariffs between Mexico and Canada and the United States, and I'm actually just going to interject here something that will not become relevant for you for a while, but I want to put it in your head now. NAFTA isn't an international organization, it's just a trade deal. So when we start talking about intranational and supranational organizations, NAFTA is neither. It's a piece of paper that commits three governments to reduce their tariffs with each other. The result of that is that foreign investment in Mexico is going to increase. Manufacturing exports from Mexico are going to continue increasing. So again, this is going to accelerate existing trends. It's not going to create a brand new thing. Mexico's economy is going to diversify. It's in particular going to become a lot less dependent on exporting oil to foreign countries because of that increased investment in manufacturing. The North-South gap, as you've now heard me say at least 78 times, is going to become wider because factories in Mexico's north are in a lot better position to export to the United States and Canada than factories anywhere else in Mexico. And the consequence will be regional migration. One last note on this. You have probably, if you pay any attention to the news, heard that Donald Trump, when he ran for president in 2016, campaigned on ending NAFTA. And he did, in fact, follow through on that and renegotiate a new trade agreement with Mexico and Canada called the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement, USMCA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which is a way less pronounceable name. In point of fact, it is quite similar. And so that relatively free trade zone between the US, Mexico, and Canada has persisted despite the change in name and the change in some of the legal terms of that agreement. Okay, last issue that I want to focus on today is Mexico's oil sector. As I have said, for some reason, there's a bunch of oil exporting states in the AP CompGov course. Mexico offers us, I think, actually kind of an intermediate picture of what it means for an economy to move away from dependence on oil, to be able to benefit from oil without becoming totally susceptible to the problems of oil production and oil dependency that characterize, for instance, Nigeria, which we'll talk about later in this course. So first things first, oil remains technically nationalized in Mexico. In this course, the United Kingdom is the only country in which oil is not the property of the state at the end of the day. But the arrangements for extracting oil in Mexico have shifted dramatically in the last 10 years. So as I said, in the 1930s, under Lázaro Cárdenas, the state creates this organization called Pemex and gives it a monopoly over oil extraction in Mexico. So this is a state-owned company, and it is the only company that was legally authorized for like 80 years to produce oil in Mexico. However, started around the 2010s, and particularly in the 2012 campaign for Mexico's presidency, Enrique Peña Nieto, who's the winning pre-candidate, starts identifying some problems with Pemex. He's not the only person to do this, but he is the person who manages to do something about it, so we're going to give him credit for this. Number one, Pemex is fairly inefficient. It loses a ton of money because, and I'll give you the kind of standard free market capitalist argument against state companies in general here. It's not just responsive to market incentives, it's also responsive to what the government needs from it, because ultimately it's the Mexican state that runs Pemex. And so, for instance, the Mexican state will always try to tax Pemex at a fairly high rate so that it can get money out out of the oil industry in order to spend it on other stuff. Whereas the interests of efficiency would suggest that Pemex should retain its own profits in order to be able to reinvest in further production. So Pemex just isn't super competitive compared with other oil producers. In particular, in the last 10 or 20 years, more and more oil exploration, most of the oil exploration potential in Mexico is in deep water oil reserves, which are incredibly expensive to extract. And as long as Pemex is inefficient, is not super profitable, and has limited capital reserves, it's not going to be able to have the money to invest in extractive technologies that will enable it to continue exploiting Mexico's oil. I should put an asterisk on this and say that some of you, I think, when you hear the phrase exploiting Mexico's oil, are like, it would be a really good thing if everybody stopped exploiting Mexico's oil. I will leave that question aside for now because I just want us to focus on inefficiency, but I take no position on that for the purposes of this video. So Peña Nieto comes to office and in 2013 and 2014, pushes through a gigantic reform package touching the energy sector and also a whole bunch of other aspects of how Mexico's government runs. It's called the Pacto por Mexico, the Pact for Mexico. And he actually manages to get the PAN and the PRD, as well as the PRI, to agree to these reforms. There's a bunch of stuff included in this package. We'll talk about it in class if we have time. But what's really relevant here is that Peña Nieto manages to introduce some really significant reforms in Mexico's energy sector, the most important of which is ending Pemex's monopoly on oil. So he's going to allow private and foreign investors to start making deals to extract oil in Mexico. Oil remains nationalized, right? Those contracts are ultimately with the state. But this is a significant change because Pemex, for the first time, is going to have to face competition within Mexico to produce and to supply gas. Pemex, on the flip side, becomes more independent of the government. Its board of directors is made more independent. Representatives of the workers' union are removed from that board of directors, and it's removed from the control of Mexico's energy ministry. So Pemex is going to be allowed under these reforms to act more like a private company and a little bit less like a state-owned company. But the idea is now that Pemex will, in theory, be able to compete more efficiently with private companies, partly because it's going to have more independence and flexibility, and partly because it's actually going to have to face competition from these gigantic multinational corporations that have now started to invest in Mexico's oil. I will take the classic teacher dodge here and say it's probably too soon to say whether these reforms have worked, but it gives us a really interesting window into the various consequences, the possible costs, the possible benefits of privatization, particularly in the oil field. One question that I will leave you to think about, I'm not going to say anything about it, but I think we'll talk about it in class, and you should pay attention to it, especially as you watch news coming out of Mexico, is that, as you know, the López Obrador government's campaigns in 2018 on this kind of populist platform, which, among other things, really questioned whether Mexico's government was serving the people. And AMLO has been very critical of Peña Nieto's privatization reforms. He has called for Pemex to return to state control and for Mexico's oil to be used to benefit the people more directly. So he's been very critical of this privatization and liberalization. So something to watch out for, although again, too soon to say definitively, is how will AMLO's government change these trends? Is it actually going to undo a lot of these liberalization reforms, or is it actually going to just blow hot air while not actually changing anything? Keep an eye out for that as you watch Mexican politics. That's it. Thank you.